Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the twisted minds of history's most bizarre royalty, 12 kings whose habits were so strange, so utterly bewildering, that they make modern celebrity scandals look like tea parties. Picture this, you're walking through the corridors of power across centuries, where absolute authority mixed with mental instability created some of the most fascinating train wrecks in human history. These weren't just eccentric rulers. They were men whose peculiar obsessions shaped kingdoms, toppled empires, and left historians scratching their heads for centuries. You probably won't survive this journey with your faith in monarchy intact, but that's exactly why we're here. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment, letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing our global bedtime community come together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself first in the misty mountains of 19th century Bavaria, where King Ludwig II sits alone in his impossibly ornate dining room. The table stretches before him, set for 14 guests, crystal glasses catching the light from hundreds of candles. But here's the thing. You're watching the king have animated conversations with empty chairs. He's discussing Wagner's latest opera with invisible companions, raising toasts to people who exist only in his mind, and occasionally bursting into fits of laughter at jokes only he can hear. Ludwig II, known to history as the Mad King, wasn't just eccentric, he was living in a fantasy world that made Disneyland look realistic. You see him obsessing over fairy tales, spending Bavaria's entire treasury on castles that belonged more in storybooks than in the real world. His most famous creation, Neuschwanstein Castle, perched on a rocky outcrop like something from a Brothers Grimm fever dream, became the inspiration for Disney's Sleeping Beauty castle. The irony isn't lost on you, a king so detached from reality that his fantasies literally became the blueprint for the world's most famous theme park. But Ludwig's dinner parties were where his madness truly shined. You watch him conduct elaborate conversations with historical figures he'd summoned from beyond the grave. Louis XIV of France was a regular guest, along with Marie Antoinette and various saints. The servants, trained to maintain the illusion, would serve 14 courses and pour wine into glasses that would never be touched. Historians still argue whether Ludwig genuinely believed these phantoms were present or if he was simply indulging in the ultimate form of royal role-playing. The king's obsession with his fairy tale architect Wagner bordered on the supernatural. You witness Ludwig financing the composer's every whim, building entire opera houses for audiences of one himself. He'd sit alone in his private box, transported by the music, sometimes conducting along with invisible orchestras. His letters to Wagner read like love letters to a divine being, filled with references to swan knights and mythical kingdoms. During winter months, you'd find Ludwig embarking on midnight sleigh rides through the Bavarian countryside, his ornate golden sleigh pulled by teams of horses while he wore elaborate costumes inspired by his favorite operas. These weren't casual evening strolls, they were epic journeys that could last for hours. The king bundled in furs and jewels, racing through snow-covered forests while his terrified servants struggled to keep up. His relationship with reality became so tenuous that he began avoiding daylight entirely, conducting all royal business after sunset. You see him transforming his castles into nocturnal wonderlands, where every surface gleamed with gold and precious stones, where mechanical singing birds performed in jeweled cages, and where the line between fantasy and reality dissolved completely. The most haunting aspect of Ludwig's story isn't his madness, it's his loneliness. You realize that behind all the elaborate fantasies, the imaginary dinner guests and the fairy tale castles, was a man so isolated by his crown that he had to create an entire alternate reality just to have someone to talk to. His bizarre habits weren't just symptoms of mental illness, they were desperate attempts to fill a void that no amount of royal privilege could satisfy. When Ludwig died mysteriously in Lake Starnberg in 1886, his body found floating alongside his psychiatrist, you understand that his final act was as enigmatic as his life. The man who built castles in the air had finally found his way to whatever kingdom he'd been seeking all along. Your journey through royal madness now takes you back nearly 2,000 years to ancient Rome, where you encounter perhaps history's most unhinged emperor, Caligula. You step into the marble corridors of the imperial palace, where the air itself seems to crackle with dangerous unpredictability. This isn't just another tale of Roman excess. You're about to witness a ruler whose grip on reality was so tenuous that he literally tried to wage war against the ocean. Picture yourself in the Roman Senate, watching in stunned silence as 24-year-old Caligula announces that his beloved horse Incitatus has been appointed as consul, one of the highest offices in the empire. You see senators' faces drain of color as they realize this isn't some elaborate joke. The emperor is deadly serious, and in Rome, disagreeing with a mad emperor was often a death sentence. Incitatus lived better than most Romans, residing in a marble stable with ivory mangers, purple blankets and a collar of precious stones. The horse had its own house, complete with furniture and slaves to attend to its every need, but Caligula's relationship with his horse was just the tip of the iceberg. You watch him declare himself a living god, demanding that people worship him as they would Jupiter or Mars. He commissioned countless statues of himself, often replacing the heads of existing god statues with his own likeness. The emperor would spend hours having conversations with these statues, sometimes arguing with them, sometimes embracing them as if they were old friends returning his affection. His divine delusions reached their peak during his famous war against Neptune, god of the sea. You witness one of history's most bizarre military campaigns as Caligula marches his legions to the shores of Gaul, not to conquer new territories, but to do battle with the ocean itself. Picture thousands of disciplined Roman soldiers, veterans of countless battles, standing bewildered on the beach as their emperor commands them to attack the waves with their swords and spears. The scene would be comical if it weren't so terrifying. Grown men stabbing at seawater while their emperor screams orders at the horizon. After defeating the ocean, Caligula ordered his soldiers to collect seashells as spoils of war, which he then presented to the Roman Senate as proof of his victory over Neptune. He called them treasures of the sea, and demanded they be displayed in the imperial palace as trophies. Historians still argue whether this was elaborate performance art designed to humiliate his enemies, or genuine evidence of complete mental breakdown. Your glimpse into Caligula's daily routine reveals even more disturbing habits. He would stand before mirrors for hours, practicing facial expressions that he believed made him look more godlike. You see him experimenting with different poses, sometimes roaring like a lion, sometimes attempting to project divine benevolence. He commissioned artists to paint him with the heads of various gods, creating a gallery of divine self-portraits that decorated his private chambers. The emperor's relationship with the moon was particularly unsettling. During full moons, you'd find him standing on his palace balcony, having long conversations with the lunar goddess Diana. He believed she was his sister, and would often invite her to come down and sleep with him. When she failed to appear, he would fly into murderous rages, ordering executions of random citizens as punishment for the goddess's rejection. Perhaps most chilling was Caligula's habit of attending gladiator games and public executions while dining. You watch him reclining on silk cushions, casually eating grapes and delicacies, while men fought to the death mere feet away. He would sometimes interrupt meals to order additional executions, treating human life as nothing more than dinner entertainment. The emperor particularly enjoyed forcing senators to fight as gladiators, savoring their terror as they faced trained killers in the arena. His paranoia manifested in bizarre ways. He would have conversations with the moon, asking it to reveal his enemies' secrets. You see him standing in moonlit gardens, whispering to the shadows, convinced that celestial bodies were providing him with intelligence about assassination plots. This wasn't mere superstition. Caligula genuinely believed he had established a divine surveillance network that kept him informed of threats both earthly and supernatural. The most disturbing aspect of Caligula's reign wasn't his individual acts of madness, it was how his delusions infected the entire empire. You realize that when the most powerful man in the world loses his grip on reality, that madness ripples outward, forcing an entire civilization to participate in his fantasies or face deadly consequences. From Rome's marble madness, you now travel to ancient Babylon, where you encounter one of history's most powerful rulers experiencing perhaps its most humiliating downfall. King Nebuchadnezzar II, builder of the Hanging Gardens and conqueror of Jerusalem, is about to show you what happens when absolute power meets complete mental collapse. You find yourself in the greatest city of the ancient world, watching its mighty king transform from civilized ruler into something barely recognizable as human. Picture the scene. You're standing in the royal palace of Babylon, surrounded by walls decorated with brilliant blue glazed bricks depicting lions and dragons. The king who once commanded armies across the known world now crawls on all fours through his own throne room, his once magnificent robes torn and dirty, his hair grown long and wild like eagle feathers. This isn't a temporary breakdown. You're witnessing the beginning of 7 years during which Nebuchadnezzar will live like a wild animal, eating grass and sleeping under the stars. The transformation didn't happen overnight. You watch as the king's behavior becomes increasingly erratic over several months. He begins refusing cooked food, claiming it's poisoned by invisible enemies. Instead, he develops an obsession with plants, spending hours in the palace gardens, not admiring the flowers but studying the grass with the intensity of a botanist. You see him getting down on his hands and knees, examining individual blades of grass, sometimes tasting them experimentally. The Sultan's obsession with gold extends to his sexual practices. You see him ordering the creation of golden dildos, golden handcuffs, and even golden chamber pots, believing that precious metals will enhance his sexual experiences. His private chambers resemble a jewelry store designed by a sex-obsessed madman, with every surface covered in golden implements for increasingly bizarre intimate rituals. Historians still argue whether Ibrahim's behavior was the result of syphilis, inherited mental illness, or simply the toxic combination of absolute power and sexual obsession. What's certain is that his reign represented a low point in Ottoman history, a time when the empire's enemies could hardly believe their good fortune in facing such a distracted and unstable opponent. The most tragic aspect of Ibrahim's story isn't his individual madness, it's how his sexual obsessions and violent paranoia infected the entire imperial system. You realize that when the most powerful man in the empire is more interested in his fur coat collection than in governing, the consequences ripple outward, affecting millions of subjects who depend on stable leadership for their survival. Your journey through royal depravity now takes you to 18th century Denmark, where you encounter King Christian VII, whose public displays of sexual behavior shocked even the relatively tolerant European courts of his era. You step into the elegant halls of Christiansborg Palace, where rococo furniture and delicate tapestries provide an ironic backdrop for a ruler whose inability to control his sexual impulses turned royal ceremonies into exercises in public humiliation. Picture yourself at a formal state dinner, where European nobility gather to discuss treaties and trade agreements. You watch in growing horror as King Christian VII, in the middle of diplomatic negotiations, begins masturbating openly at the dinner table. The French ambassador stops mid-sentence, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth, as the Danish king continues his self-gratification while discussing grain imports. This isn't a momentary lapse in judgment. You're witnessing behavior that occurred regularly throughout Christian's reign, turning every formal occasion into a potential scandal. The king's condition manifests in ways that make governing nearly impossible. You observe him during royal audiences, where subjects come to petition their monarch for justice or favors. Christian listens to their requests while openly fondling himself, sometimes climaxing during particularly emotional pleas from desperate citizens. Court officials learn to position themselves strategically to block the king's lower body from public view, but his facial expressions and vocalizations make his activities impossible to disguise. His relationship with his wife, Queen Caroline Mathilde, becomes a source of international gossip. You watch their wedding night, where Christian's inability to distinguish between public and private behavior creates a marriage that's doomed from the start. The Queen, barely 17 and educated in the refined courts of England, finds herself married to a man who treats their bedroom like a public theater, often inviting courtiers to observe their intimate moments. What makes Christian's condition particularly disturbing is how it affects his decision-making process. You see him signing important state documents while masturbating, sometimes smearing bodily fluids across diplomatic treaties. Foreign ambassadors report having to request new copies of agreements because the originals were too stained to present to their own monarchs. The king, who should be the dignified face of Danish sovereignty, becomes its most embarrassing liability. From medieval France's crystal paranoia, you now travel to the opulent heart of the Ottoman Empire, where you encounter Sultan Ibrahim I, known to history as Ibrahim the Mad. Your journey takes you into the perfumed chambers of the Topkapi Palace, where absolute power and complete mental instability created a ruler whose sexual obsessions and violent paranoia made even the jaded Ottoman court recoil in horror. You're about to witness a reign so bizarre that it makes our previous kings look almost reasonable by comparison. Picture yourself in the Sultan's legendary harem, a place that housed over 1,000 women, where Ibrahim's madness manifested in ways that defy comprehension. You watch as the Sultan, convinced that his concubines are plotting against him, orders the drowning of 280 women in the Bosphorus Strait. But this isn't a momentary fit of rage. You see him orchestrating the mass murder with the methodical precision of a man organizing a dinner party. The women are sewn into weighted sacks and thrown into the dark waters, their crime being nothing more than existing in the same space as Ibrahim's deteriorating mind. The Sultan's relationship with his harem goes far beyond the already excessive standards of Ottoman royalty. You observe him spending entire days interviewing potential concubines, not for their beauty or intelligence but for increasingly bizarre physical specifications. He becomes obsessed with finding the fattest woman in the empire, offering enormous rewards for anyone who can bring him a concubine weighing over 300 pounds. When he finally finds her, a woman nicknamed Sugar Cube for her size, he showers her with jewels and makes her his favorite, spending hours simply watching her eat. But Ibrahim's appetites extend beyond human companionship. You witness him developing an erotic relationship with a fur coat, treating the garment as if it were a living lover. Palace servants report finding him in intimate embraces with various furs, silk garments and even pieces of furniture. The Sultan's private chambers become a bizarre collection of objects that serve as substitutes for human intimacy, each one treated with the reverence normally reserved for beloved partners. His paranoia manifests in increasingly creative ways. You watch Ibrahim become convinced that his penis is too small, leading him to consult with physicians, mystics, and even foreign ambassadors for advice on enlargement techniques. He tries everything from herbal remedies to magical rituals, sometimes spending entire state meetings discussing his anatomical concerns with bewildered foreign dignitaries. The Sultan, who controls one of the world's most powerful empires, is reduced to seeking penis enlargement advice from Venetian merchants. The most disturbing aspect of Ibrahim's madness is how it affects his governance. You see him making crucial military decisions based on the advice of his favorite concubines, sometimes in the middle of intimate encounters. Battle plans are discussed while the Sultan is engaged in various sexual acts, with generals forced to deliver strategic updates to a ruler who's literally in bed with his advisors. The Ottoman Empire, which once struck fear into the hearts of European monarchs, is now being run from a bedroom by a man who consults his penis for foreign policy advice. Remember that mass drowning we mentioned earlier? Ibrahim's method of execution reveals the calculated nature of his madness. You observe him personally selecting which women will die, sometimes basing his decisions on their reactions to his bizarre sexual requests. A concubine who shows disgust at his fur coat fetish might find herself marked for death, while one who participates enthusiastically in his increasingly strange rituals might earn temporary safety. His relationship with animals becomes another source of palace horror. You watch Ibrahim developing romantic attachments to various creatures, treating them as members of his harem. He orders the construction of special chambers for his animal lovers, complete with silk bedding and perfumed oils. Palace servants, already traumatized by their duties, now find themselves caring for the Sultan's menagerie of sexual partners, a job that would challenge even the most experienced royal staff. Your journey through royal eccentricity now takes you to Ming Dynasty China, where you encounter Emperor Zhengde, whose obsession with role-playing and escape from imperial duties created one of history's most elaborate royal fantasies. You step into the forbidden city of early 16th century Beijing, where traditional Chinese architecture and ancient protocols provide the backdrop for a ruler who preferred playing shopkeeper to governing the world's most populous empire. Picture yourself walking through the streets of Beijing, where you discover something that shouldn't exist, a fully functional marketplace built inside the imperial palace complex. You watch Emperor Zhengde, dressed in common merchant clothing, haggling over the price of silk scarves with palace eunuchs who are pretending to be customers. This isn't a brief diversion from imperial duties. You're witnessing an elaborate alternate reality where the Son of Heaven spends months at a time playing the role of a common tradesman. The Emperor's fake market is a masterpiece of imperial self-deception. You observe hundreds of palace servants acting as merchants, customers, and even pickpockets, all dedicated to maintaining the illusion that their emperor is living the life of a regular Beijing shopkeeper. The marketplace includes everything from food stalls to silk merchants, complete with fake money, staged arguments between vendors, and even scripted robberies that allow Zhengde to play the hero who saves the day. But the emperor's role-playing goes far beyond merchant fantasies. You watch him constructing an entire alternate identity as a military general, complete with a fake name, fabricated backstory, and invented military achievements. He leads his palace guards on mock battles through the imperial gardens, commanding imaginary armies against invisible enemies. The sight of China's emperor crawling through bushes while playing soldier would be comical if it weren't so tragic for the empire's actual governance. His obsession with common life extends to areas that shock even his tolerant court. You see Zhengde building a fake brothel inside the palace, complete with trained courtesans who pretend to be prostitutes serving regular customers. The emperor pays for these services with real money, treating the encounter as if he's just another customer rather than the man who owns everything in the empire. His fantasy world becomes so elaborate that he sometimes forgets his real identity for days at a time. The practical consequences of Zhengde's role-playing are staggering. You watch as important state documents pile up unread while the emperor is busy learning how to properly fold dumplings in his fake restaurant. Foreign ambassadors wait for weeks to meet with a ruler who's too busy pretending to be a traveling merchant to conduct international diplomacy. The empire that once struck fear into neighboring kingdoms is now being ignored by its own emperor in favor of elaborate games of make-believe. His relationship with his real imperial duties becomes increasingly strained. You observe moments when court officials interrupt Zhengde's merchant fantasies to discuss genuine crises, rebellions, floods, invasions, only to watch the emperor respond as if these real problems are just more elaborate role-playing scenarios. He'll assign palace servants to play the roles of rebel leaders or foreign generals, completely missing the fact that these threats are actually destroying his empire. The emperor's fake identities multiply over time. You see him creating entire fictional personas, a traveling monk who gives spiritual advice to palace servants, a wandering scholar who debates philosophy with his own ministers, even a common laborer who performs manual tasks alongside the palace groundskeepers. Each identity comes with its own wardrobe, backstory, and social circle, creating a complex web of fantasy that consumes more and more of his time and attention. Historians still argue whether Zhengde's behavior represented a form of dissociative disorder, a creative response to the crushing pressures of absolute rule, or simply the logical endpoint of imperial privilege taken to extremes. What's certain is that his reign marked a turning point in Chinese imperial history, demonstrating how a ruler's psychological needs could take precedence over an empire's survival. The most disturbing aspect of Zhengde's story is how his fantasy world becomes more real to him than his actual responsibilities. You watch him investing genuine emotion in his fake relationships with pretend customers and imaginary friends, while remaining completely indifferent to the millions of real subjects whose lives depend on his leadership. The emperor, who should be the central figure holding Chinese civilization together, instead becomes a man lost in his own elaborate daydreams. Remember that fake brothel we mentioned? Zhengde's sexual fantasies become intertwined with his role-playing in ways that blur the line between performance and reality, creating a private world where the most powerful man in China becomes just another customer seeking temporary escape from the pressures of existence. From China's elaborate fantasies, you now travel to Renaissance Prague, where you encounter Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, whose obsession with alchemy and the occult transformed his court into Europe's strangest laboratory. You step into the shadowy corridors of Prague Castle, where Gothic spires and medieval stonework hide chambers filled with bubbling chemicals, caged exotic animals, and scholars pursuing the impossible dream of turning lead into gold. Picture yourself descending into the emperor's private laboratory, deep beneath the castle, where the air is thick with chemical fumes and the walls are lined with bottles containing mysterious specimens. You watch Rudolf II, dressed in robes covered with astrological symbols, hunched over an alchemical apparatus that looks more like torture equipment than scientific instruments. This isn't casual royal hobby. You're witnessing a ruler who has transformed his entire empire into a playground for occult experimentation. The emperor's collection of alchemists, mystics, and charlatans reads like a medieval comic book convention. You observe him consulting with John Dee, the English mathematician and occultist, about how to communicate with angels using specially constructed mirrors. Rudolf believes these conversations will reveal the secrets of immortality, and he's willing to spend the empire's treasury on increasingly elaborate supernatural experiments. His court becomes a magnet for every fortune teller, astrologer, and would-be wizard in Europe. But Rudolf's obsessions go far beyond simple alchemy. You watch him constructing an elaborate menagerie of exotic animals, believing that studying their behaviors will unlock cosmic secrets. His private zoo includes lions from Africa, bears from Russia, and even a dodo bird from the distant island of Mauritius. The emperor spends hours observing these creatures, taking detailed notes about their eating habits, mating rituals, and responses to various magical incantations. His relationship with his court astronomer, Tycho Brahe, reveals the strange intersection of genuine science and royal madness. You see Rudolf funding Brahe's groundbreaking astronomical observations, not out of scientific curiosity, but because he believes accurate star charts will help him predict the future and control supernatural forces. The emperor, who should be governing the Holy Roman Empire instead, spends his nights on castle towers, staring at the sky while waiting for cosmic revelations. The most disturbing aspect of Rudolf's obsessions is how they affect his imperial duties. You watch him making crucial political decisions based on astrological calculations rather than practical considerations. Military campaigns are planned according to planetary alignments, diplomatic negotiations are scheduled around lunar phases, and even tax collection is organized according to occult principles. The empire that once dominated European politics is now being run according to star charts and crystal ball readings. His collection of magical objects becomes legendary throughout Europe. You observe Rudolf's treasure chambers, filled with supposed relics from biblical times, crystals that allegedly channel divine energy, and books written in languages that may or may not exist. He pays enormous sums for anything that promises supernatural power, from Egyptian mummies to pieces of the true cross. His palace becomes a museum of magical thinking, where every object is believed to possess otherworldly properties. The emperor's personal hygiene suffers dramatically due to his alchemical experiments. You see him covered in chemical stains, his hair and beard discolored from exposure to various substances, his hands permanently stained with compounds that might or might not be poisonous. Court physicians express concern about his health, but Rudolf dismisses their warnings, convinced that his experiments are bringing him closer to immortality. His relationship with women becomes complicated by his occult beliefs. You watch Rudolf consulting with female mystics and fortune-tellers, some of whom claim to be witches with genuine supernatural powers. These relationships blur the lines between spiritual consultation, sexual attraction, and political influence, creating a court where the emperor's romantic life is indistinguishable from his magical pursuits. Historians still argue whether Rudolf's occult obsessions represented genuine mental illness, a sophisticated form of Renaissance humanism, or simply the logical result of unlimited power combined with medieval superstition. What's certain is that his reign marked a turning point in European history, demonstrating how a ruler's personal obsessions could reshape an entire empire's priorities. The most tragic aspect of Rudolf's story is how his search for supernatural power made him increasingly powerless in the real world. You realize that while he was trying to turn lead into gold, his actual empire was crumbling around him. The man who sought to control cosmic forces couldn't even control his own nobles, and his obsession with immortality ultimately led to political death. Remember that dodo bird we mentioned? Rudolf's exotic menagerie becomes a symbol of his entire reign, a collection of rare and wonderful things that couldn't survive in the real world, much like his own imperial authority. Your final stop in this journey through royal madness brings you to 18th century England, where you encounter King George III, whose mysterious illness and bizarre behavior patterns helped lose Britain an empire and created one of history's most tragic royal figures. You step into the Georgian splendor of Windsor Castle, where elegant architecture and refined protocols mask a ruler whose purple urine and violent outbursts transformed the British monarchy into a medical mystery that continues to puzzle doctors today. Picture yourself in the royal apartments, where you witness King George III during one of his famous episodes. The man who once ruled the largest empire in human history is now strapped to a chair, raving about imaginary enemies while his urine glows an eerie purple color in the chamber pot. You watch court physicians examining this strange bodily fluid, completely baffled by a symptom that seems to belong more in a fairy tale than a medical case study. The king's condition manifests in ways that terrify even his experienced courtiers. You observe him during violent episodes, when the mild-mannered monarch who loved farming and simple pleasures transforms into someone who doesn't recognize his own family. He speaks rapidly in a torrent of words that make no grammatical sense, mixing Latin phrases with nursery rhymes while making sexual advances toward court ladies who've known him since childhood. The transformation is so complete that witnesses wonder if they're seeing the same person. His relationship with his doctors becomes a source of additional trauma. You watch the royal physicians, led by the notorious Dr. Francis Willis, subjecting their patient to treatments that seem designed more for punishment than healing. George is forced into a straitjacket called a restraining chair, subjected to blistering and purging, and even tied to his bed when his ravings become too violent. The sight of the King of England being treated like a dangerous animal creates a constitutional crisis that threatens the very foundations of British government. The political implications of George's madness are staggering. You realize that his illness directly contributed to Britain's loss of the American colonies, as his inability to govern effectively prevented the flexible diplomacy that might have preserved the empire. While George raved about purple elephants and imaginary conspiracies, His former subjects were declaring independence and creating a new nation. The king's madness becomes intertwined with some of the most important events in world history. His periods of recovery provide glimpses into the man behind the illness. You watch George during his lucid intervals, when he's painfully aware of what he's become and deeply ashamed of his behavior during the mad episodes. He apologizes to courtiers he's insulted, tries to repair relationships he's damaged, and expresses genuine anguish about his inability to control his own mind. These moments of clarity make his condition even more heartbreaking. The mystery of George's purple urine becomes a medical detective story that continues to fascinate researchers. You see doctors collecting samples, testing various theories, and completely missing the connection between the king's symptoms and what we now recognize as porphyria, a rare genetic disorder that affects the nervous system. The strange urine color, violent episodes, and periods of madness all fit the pattern of this hereditary condition, but 18th century medicine lacks the knowledge to make this connection. His relationship with his wife, Queen Charlotte, becomes a study in loyalty under impossible circumstances. You watch her maintaining dignity while her husband makes inappropriate sexual advances toward other women, speaks nonsense during state dinners, and sometimes doesn't recognize her for weeks at a time. The Queen learns to love a man who periodically disappears into madness, leaving behind a stranger who happens to wear the same face. The impact of George's illness on his children creates a dynasty shadowed by mental instability. You observe his sons learning to navigate a world where their father might be a loving parent one day and a raving stranger the next. The psychological trauma of growing up with a mad king affects the entire royal family, creating patterns of behavior that will influence British royalty for generations. Historians still argue whether George III's madness was caused by porphyria, bipolar disorder, or arsenic poisoning from the lead-based makeup and medicines of his era. What's certain is that his illness changed the course of world history, demonstrating how a single person's mental health can affect millions of lives across multiple continents. The most profound aspect of George's story is how it humanizes the concept of absolute power. You realize that behind all the royal ceremony and imperial authority was a man struggling with forces beyond his control, just like any other human being. The king who lost an empire was also a father who couldn't control his own mind, a husband who couldn't recognize his own wife, and a human being trapped inside a body that had become his enemy. As George's story draws to a close, you understand that his purple urine has become a symbol of something larger, the mysterious ways that biology can override politics, how personal suffering can reshape history, and how even the most powerful people in the world are ultimately subject to forces they can neither understand nor control. The soft glow of candlelight flickers across ancient palace walls as our journey through royal madness draws to its gentle close. You've walked alongside kings who spoke to horses, rulers who believed they were made of glass, and emperors who preferred playing shopkeeper to governing empires. These weren't just stories of individual madness, they were windows into the human condition, reminders that power and privilege cannot protect us from the mysteries of our own minds. As you settle deeper into your pillows, let these tales remind you that even in the darkest moments of history, there's something profoundly human about the struggles we've witnessed. Ludwig's lonely dinners with invisible friends, Charles's terror of his own fragility, George's purple urine glowing in the darkness, all of these bizarre details speak to universal truths about isolation, fear, and the strange ways our minds can both protect and betray us. The castles grow quiet now, their mad kings finally at rest. The alchemical laboratories have cooled, the fake marketplaces have closed, and the glass monarch sleeps safely wrapped in silk. These stories fade into the peaceful darkness of history, where all human struggles eventually find their rest. Let your own thoughts drift like autumn leaves, settling gently into the quiet spaces between waking and sleep, where the line between reality and dreams becomes as thin as moonlight on water. Close your eyes and let these ancient voices whisper themselves into silence, carrying you toward whatever dreams await in the soft, forgiving darkness of another peaceful night.